At first, the world thought history was being made. A young African leader, still in his 30s, was honored with the nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. Headlines praised him as the voice of Africa's new dawn. Crowds in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, celebrated in the streets, believing that President Ibrahim had finally placed their country among the great names of world history. For many, it felt like a moment to rival Mandela's triumph or Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream. But then came the shock. Only 3 days later, rejected the honor. He declared the Nobel Prize was not a gift, but a trap of velvet chain designed by the G7 to tame his country's independence. In one stroke, he turned glory into defiance, admiration into controversy. Washington, Paris, Brussels, and Tokyo were left stunned, while young Africans hailed him as a hero unafraid to stand alone. This was not just about a medal or $1 million prize. It was about sovereignty, dignity, and whether a nation could resist the pull of global powers. If you believe Africa's awakening has truly begun, subscribe now and stay with us until the very end of this story. On July 27, 2025, the world turned its attention to a small West African nation. Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim, had just been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. At only 36 years old, he was hailed as the youngest head of state in Africa, a man who had brought order to a nation scarred by conflict. For 3 days, global headlines praised him as the embodiment of Africa's promise. The Nobel Committee cited his efforts to stabilize the Sahel, unite regional forces against terrorism, and pursue economic independence free from colonial influence. Commentators in Europe compared him to Nelson Mandela. Some in the United States even dared to call him a new Gandhi for Africa. In Ouagadougou, citizens gathered in the streets, chanting his name. For many Africans, the Nobel nod felt like long-awaited recognition from a world that had too often ignored their struggles. But just 72 hours later, shattered the illusion. In a handwritten letter to the Nobel Committee, he announced that he would not accept the award or the $1.1 million that came with it. His reasoning was blunt. The prize was not a true recognition of peace, but a leash meant to bind Burkina Faso to Western powers. "We will not trade our sovereignty for symbols," he declared. The decision stunned Oslo. It angered Paris. It confused Washington. And yet across much of Africa, it electrified the youth. What many had assumed would be a story of honor became instead a manifesto of resistance. Transition. But this was only the beginning, because this rejection of the Nobel did not end the story. It unleashed a storm of global reactions that revealed far deeper truths about power, control, and the future of Africa. When Ibrahim finally spoke to the world, his words cut deeper than any rejection letter. Standing before the people of Burkina Faso in Ouagadougou, he declared, "They want to crown me only to control me. I will never be their puppet. The future of Burkina Faso cannot be bought for $1.1 million. It was a fiery speech. But it was also more than that. It was a line in the sand. For decades, the Nobel Peace Prize had been viewed as the highest moral honor, yet unveiled its darker side. A tool of influence, a velvet chain disguised as a laurel wreath. He reminded his nation that true African revolutionaries, like Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Kwame Nkrumah, were never handed Nobel medals. Why? Because they were too independent, too uncontrollable for Western powers to celebrate. The symbolism was undeniable. By rejecting the Nobel, he elevated himself from Nomi to defier. A man willing to confront not just terrorism in the Sahel, but also the global system that had long dictated Africa's path. His words spread across radios, phones, and television screens. Markets paused. University students stopped their lectures to watch. In villages where people still struggled with hunger, his voice carried a message. Dignity is worth more than gold. Inside Burkina Faso, young people lifted his portrait high, calling him the new sun. On social media, hashtags like NobelTrap, hashtag True Sovereignty, and hashtag Africa Rising trended worldwide. Was no longer just a president, he had become a symbol. Transition. But symbols, especially those born in defiance, rarely remain confined to one country. The reactions from across the world revealed just how much this act unsettled the balance of power. The first tremors were felt in Europe. In France, President Emmanuel Macron's reaction was one of fury. Paris, still stung by losing influence in its former colony, called this move an insult to the moral order. French commentators warned that Burkina Faso risked isolation. But among Africans, this anger only reinforced this point. Independence often comes at the price of Western disapproval. In the United States, the media was split. CNN dismissed Traoré's rejection as reckless symbolism, accusing him of turning away from diplomacy. Fox News, however, asked a harder question. Had the Nobel itself lost its moral weight? In Brussels, the European Union convened an urgent meeting. Leaders worried that its boldness could embolden other African nations to resist EU aid programs. Diplomats spoke of a potential diplomatic breach that could spread beyond Burkina Faso. Even Tokyo weighed in, calling the rejection an erosion of trust in global institutions. Japan's caution reflected a growing fear. If leaders openly dismissed long-standing symbols of legitimacy, what other institutions might fall next? But while the West scrambled, the Global South celebrated. Across Africa, students in Dakar, Lagos, and Kinshasa held rallies in solidarity. Intellectuals praised as a rare leader who placed sovereignty above money. In Latin America, movements in Brazil and Bolivia compared him to their own champions of independence. In Asia, Indian newspapers framed the event as part of a wider awakening of the Global South. A single letter of rejection had become a spark. What was once seen as a personal choice was now a global confrontation between old powers and rising nations. Transition. Yet every confrontation carries consequences not only abroad, but also within the fragile heart of Burkina Faso itself. Inside Burkina Faso, the rejection of the Nobel Peace Prize was not seen as arrogance, it was embraced as an act of liberation. In Ouagadougou, crowds gathered in Independence Square, waving flags and chanting songs of freedom. Teachers brought the news into classrooms, using it to explain the meaning of sovereignty to a new generation. The story spread quickly into rural villages, where elders nodded with pride and told children, "We are no one's puppet." Artists and musicians responded first. Folk singers began composing ballads about dignity and sacrifice, while graffiti artists painted S likeness beside that of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary icon assassinated in 1987. Too many. This moment felt like a continuation of Sankara's dream, resurrected through his courage. But not all voices were celebratory. Business leaders quietly worried about Western retaliation. Farmers asked what would happen if aid shipments slowed or sanctions were imposed. Mothers in the markets wondered whether food prices might rise if trade with Europe faltered. The rejection of the Nobel became more than a political statement. It became a national gamble with real risks. Still, the dominant emotion was pride. The youth, who make up over 60% of Burkina Faso's population, rallied around. Their message was simple: better hunger with dignity than bread with chains. This generational shift turned a potential moment of crisis into a movement of cultural rebirth. Transition. Yet the story did not end within Burkina Faso's borders. Across the region, leaders and citizens alike wrestled with what a stand would mean for them. In neighboring Mali and Niger, where governments also faced the legacy of French control, S rejection was celebrated as a shared victory. Leaders there quickly expressed solidarity, framing it as proof that the Sahel could unite outside Western oversight. The newly formed Sahel Alliance began to envision itself not just as a military pact, but as a political bloc with the potential to redefine African independence. Meanwhile, in West African capitals like Accra and Abidjan, reactions were more cautious. Ghana and d'Ivoire, heavily tied to Western trading aid, hesitated to embrace Traoré's defiance. Their leaders admired his courage, but quietly worried about the economic consequences for a region still vulnerable to poverty and external debt. Within Burkina Faso itself, political debate intensified. Opposition figures accused of recklessness, warning that symbolism could not feed the hungry. They argued that $1.1 million could have built schools or hospitals. Yet their criticisms struggled to gain traction in the streets, where popular support for remained overwhelming. The rejection also reshaped alliances. Russia and China, eager to expand influence in Africa, praised S defiance and hinted at economic partnerships. Meanwhile, Western diplomats scrambled to contain the fallout, fearing that one bold refusal could inspire a wave of resistance across the continent. In every corner of Burkina Faso and beyond, the Nobel rejection forced people to ask a simple but dangerous question. If this young leader could say no to the West, why couldn't others? Transition. And as the dust settled, the world, especially in the United States, turned to examine what this act meant for the global balance of power. In the United States, Ibrahim's rejection of the Nobel Peace Prize landed like a thunderclap. For decades, Americans had viewed the prize as a symbol of virtue awarded to leaders who advanced peace, reconciliation, and democracy. But S words forced a deeper question. Was the Nobel still about peace, or had it become an instrument of politics? Major media outlets split sharply. CNN portrayed as reckless, framing his decision as proof that Burkina Faso risked alienating international allies. Editorials warned that his rhetoric could destabilize West Africa and invite instability. By contrast, Fox News ran segments asking whether the Nobel had become too political to mean anything anymore. Conservative commentators noted that even Henry Kissinger, whose policies were divisive, once received the award. If the prize could be politicized in the past, why not now? Speaking at a rally, he remarked, "Maybe S right. Maybe the Nobel is a political trap." His comments sparked heated debate in Washington, revealing how deeply divided American opinion had become. Beyond the headlines, ordinary Americans, especially older generations, who remembered the Cold War, Vietnam, and Iraq, felt a sense of déjà vu. They had seen how awards, treaties, and international institutions could be wielded for influence. S defiance resonated with those who had long suspected that global recognition often carried hidden strings. Transition. But America was not alone. Across the wider world, S refusal struck chords of solidarity, resistance, and alarm. In Africa, S decision was celebrated as a moment of awakening. In universities across Nigeria and South Africa, students debated what it meant for sovereignty in the modern world. Intellectuals drew parallels to earlier independence movements, declaring that Africa's second liberation might have begun in Burkina Faso. Even leaders who remained aligned with the West privately admitted that S courage had shifted the conversation. In Asia, newspapers in India and Indonesia framed the rejection as part of a wider global South awakening. For decades, these nations had felt lectured by the West about governance and democracy. Even as Western powers benefited from their resources, S refusal became a symbol that the global South could stand on its own terms. In Latin America, activists compared Traore to leaders like Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales figures, who challenged U.S. and European. Brazil's student movements adopted slogans inspired by Burkina Faso's defiance, arguing that no prize can replace true sovereignty. Meanwhile, in Europe, policymakers feared the erosion of soft power. If the Nobel, seen as the moral compass of the West, could be rejected so publicly, what did that mean for the future of Western influence? Diplomats whispered that legitimacy itself was now on trial. For international institutions like the UN, IMF, and World Bank, the event carried a chilling message. If a small, landlocked country like Burkina Faso could reject the most prestigious award in the world, other nations might start rejecting loans, programs, or agreements that came with conditions. S defiance was more than symbolic. It was contagious. Transition. And then came the twist. What began as a rejection of a prize soon transformed into something far larger. A declaration that shifted the balance of power and recast Ibrahim not only as Burkina Faso's leader, but as an icon of a rising global movement. What began as a rejection of a $1.1 million Nobel Prize quickly evolved into something no one had anticipated. A rallying cry for a global movement. S Act was not simply about refusing money or prestige, it was about redefining legitimacy itself. By tearing up the script handed to him by powerful nations, he forced the world to ask, who decides what peace looks like, and who has the right to reward it? In Burkina Faso, this rejection transformed from a single speech into a manifesto. Young people painted slogans across city walls. Dignity is our Nobel. Universities began teaching classes on sovereignty using S-words as primary text. Across Africa, politicians who had once been cautious suddenly found themselves pressured by their citizens to follow Traoré's example. What shocked observers most was how quickly this defiance spread beyond borders. In less than a month, activists in Nigeria, Senegal, and the Democratic Republic of Congo organized conferences titled The Nobel Question. Suddenly, the prize that was once an unquestionable symbol of moral authority had become a lightning rod of debate. Transition. But the true twist came when the world realized that was not just tearing down a symbol, it was building something new in its place. Rather than retreat into isolation, moved swiftly to channel the energy of rejection into creation. In a bold announcement, he declared that Burkina Faso would launch an African prize for true sovereignty. Unlike the Nobel, it would not be funded by Western governments or foundations. Instead, it would be financed by African nations pooling their own resources. Its mission: to honor leaders, activists, and communities who advance independence, dignity, and justice without foreign strings attached. This announcement sent shockwaves through the diplomatic world. Western analysts dismissed it as symbolic posturing, but within Africa, the idea resonated deeply. For the first time, there was a prize not awarded by outsiders, but by Africans themselves. For Africans. Global institutions braced for impact. Commentators noted that if the Nobel represented the old world order, S Prize represented the birth of a new one. The rejection had become creation. Defiance had become leadership. In the eyes of many, this was no longer just the story of a young captain turned president. It was the story of a continent beginning to write its own narrative without permission, without apology, and without fear. Transition. And as the new prize was announced, the world held its breath, for if the Nobel could be rejected, and a new symbol could rise in its place, what else might the future hold? In the closing moments of this saga, Ibrahim's rejection of the Nobel Peace Prize was no longer seen as an isolated act. It had become a chapter in a much larger story, the story of Africa standing at the threshold of its own rebirth. His words echoed far beyond Burkina Faso. Our dignity is not for sale. Our future is not negotiable. For ordinary citizens, this was more than rhetoric. Farmers in the Sahel, students in universities, and workers in crowded cities began to see themselves reflected in this message. They were not waiting for permission from Paris, Washington, or Brussels. They were claiming the right to chart their own destiny. And while Western powers dismissed as defiant, the truth was undeniable. His voice had ignited conversations across the globe about sovereignty, power, and the very meaning of peace. By refusing the Nobel, had achieved something greater than any medal could offer. He had given his people, and perhaps the world, a new vision of freedom. Transition. But the story does not end in Burkina Faso. It belongs to all who believe that dignity matters more than gold, and that true peace must be built from the ground up. As the dust settled, the world found itself divided between those who saw as reckless and those who saw him as a prophet of a new era. Yet regardless of opinion, no one could deny that he had shifted the conversation. Once invisible on the global stage, Burkina Faso now stood as a symbol of defiance and renewal. The lesson of this moment is clear. True sovereignty does not come from prizes, foreign aid, or international applause. It comes from courage courage to say no when the world expects you to say yes, and the courage to dream of a different future even when the risks are immense. And so, the story of Ibrahim's Nobel rejection is not really about a medal at all. It is about something far greater. The awakening of a people, the birth of a movement, and the reminder that even the smallest nation can shake the foundations of the world when it dares to stand tall. Final closing line. This is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of Africa's bold new era.